Hello everybody, welcome back to our Spring Boot series. Today I'd like to talk about the difference between component and configuration. What is a component? Component is a notation that you put on a class to mark it as a Spring managed component. And when we talk about components, of course, we include something like service, repository, REST controller, and others. They are also components because those annotations, they include already the component there if you look into the source code. And of course, all the components will be automatically discovered during class path scanning, meaning when your application starts, Spring will look for components in your source code, meaning class with an annotation that is a component, and it will create them unless you have a different scope. Scope will be the subject for a different video, but if you don't know, every time you use the component just like this, or a service or repository again, they will be singletons, meaning that if you have multiple requests to your web server in Spring Boot, if you are using it for a Spring server, the same instance will be used for all the requests, unless you change the scope. But again, it will be the subject for a different video. So this is an example about how to mark a class as a bin. So we put here the component and that's it. What is configuration? It's a specialized form of component, meaning that it's used to declare bin producing methods. It's not the class myConfig that will be a bin. It will be any method that it's inside this class configuration marked as a bin. The data type here will be the bin, meaning that we can inject the result of this method. Well, what is it? It means that when Spring Boot looks into this configuration, and it needs this configuration annotation to understand it should look inside. Because in Java, if you just put annotations in methods, but you don't put an annotation on the class, you don't know if you have to try to use reflection to find methods with annotations or not. That's why it's a good practice to put always an annotation at the class level to indicate to Spring Boot and say, okay, I have something inside my class that you should look for. And this will be bins. And what the Spring Boot will do, it just execute the method, and it will take the return data type as a bin, like the same way that this one, which means that it will be also singletons. This means, and this is quite important, sometimes people have some problems to understand this. If I use this bin in different injection parts, and the bins are to be injected, even if they are classes or methods, they will be injected. After the first execution, this instance will be put on the internal context of the Spring Boot, and every time you use this bin, my service, it will be that instance that will be used, and this method will not be executed anymore. I'll repeat, this method will only be executed once, even if you use it 10 times, meaning you inject this bin 10 times, because they are singleton by default, unless you change the scope, and that it's possible to pass a parameter here. But again, it will be the subject for a different video. But if you want to read about it, please do it. Sometimes people think, okay, it's a method, every time I inject, the method will be executed. No, it will not. This is a bin. Bin meaning that the Spring Boot will scan for it, will find this method, execute the method, take the result, okay, and it will be injected the same instance for all the injections that you have in your application. So be careful, because sometimes people don't understand this behavior and they try to find bugs that don't exist. It's just a bad use of Spring Boot. So it is used to declare bin producing methods. Typical represents a Java-based configuration class. Why the configuration? Because most of the times what you will have inside, it will be class related with configuration, authentications, authorizations, data source, and things like that. But you can create any bin as you want. And one of the advantages of this is that you can do whatever you want in this code. You can decide, for instance, if this is an interface, you can decide which implementation should be returned regarding something that you look for in another service, a configuration file, whatever you want to do inside the method. That's one of the advantages to use the bins as methods and not as components, because the component is just a class, and Spring Boot will look for a constructor. Here, it's not a constructor, it's the execution of this method. Okay. conceptual difference. So from the primary purpose, the component's auto-detectable Spring Bean, and the class bean using bean methods. At the end of the day, it's almost the same thing, but the purpose is a different. This is usually targets more configurations and custom initializations when you need some custom thing to do, not a class per se. And of course, conceptually, you will want the component to be something related with your software design, and these beans will support the components. That's something like that if you want to decide. But I'm sure that you will find use case for this. Every time you try to create a component, say it's very difficult, I need some customization, I can't do it in my constructor in the component, maybe you should try to find your solution under the configuration. So bean declaration, it's implicit, it's via class. Here is explicit via methods, because it's implicit because you have the class or maybe an interface and multiple implementations. This is the component. But from the point of view on the method is explicit because you really say, this is a bean and I want this data type to be returned. Okay, you are everything is explicit. You are really describing what do you really want. Here it's implicit because again, if you have, for instance, an interface here, Spring Boot will look for implementations of this interface that are marked as components and try to use them. Okay. Proxy behavior, not proxy enforced on the component. Here there is a library called cglib that will create proxies. This is a very advanced concept that I will talk about it in the future. But every time you have beans, imagine that you have a class. Okay. I don't want to go too deep here, but I think it deserves at least 30 seconds or 1 minute to talk about it. When you have this component, an instance will be created and it will be kept on a specific place inside the Spring Boot. And every time you do an injection or you need an instance, that one will be provided. And if the scope is singleton, it will always be the same instance. But here, this is a method. It is not a class that is defined. So everything is explicit. And Spring Boot, of course, will take this bean here, the instance, and will keep like this one. But you will create a proxy around. Meaning it will create a class with these methods inside, and he will decide if he has to execute the method or not. For instance, if it is a singleton, it will not execute it, because if it's singleton, it was already created at the start, so it was executed once, so there is no reason to execute the method again. But if, for instance, it's a request scope, meaning that every time there's a request on your application and there is a need to create a class and inject this bean, if it's a request, he'll execute again the method. But this decision should be take at runtime, so it will not be this class. This class will never be executed by you. It will be executed somehow in a magic things by Spring Boot. And that's why there is the need to create a proxy, meaning a class that is created around this configuration here, or maybe a class around this method. And every time you want to inject, that class will check what is the scope. If the scope is singleton, okay, just return the instance. But if it's a request, it will execute again the method. So you need a kind of it's a proxy. I can explain it in a different way. So it's a kind of a front controller, meaning before you execute the method, it's a kind of a trigger in a database. Say, okay, something before trigger, before doing something, let's check this first. Oh, okay, it's not necessary to create an instance. Oh, maybe it's a request scope. I have to create a different one. So in that case, I will have to execute the method again. That's why there is some need to create a proxy, and for that it is used this CG lib. And it is possible to use proxies also when we have components, but it's for advanced things like transactions, expect-oriented programming, and things like that. So advanced configuration, not intended for config. The main idea of component, it's the classes that compose your software design, like services, REST controllers, things like that. The configuration fully supports complex configs, because at the end of the day, it's a method that you can put whatever you want inside it. Okay. So technical difference: configuration classes are proxified by cglib, as I said, and ensures that the bin methods returns singletons, or if you are using a different scope, they will return other types of instance. Component class do not proxy method calls, unless you are using expect-oriented programming and things like that. So this is true for the technical difference, but you can apply also proxies to component class, and in some advanced scenarios it's quite common. So this is just a diagram representing this. So you have the Spring context, and every time it tries to retrieve a bin, he has a kind of a class called proxy app config, which will be a proxy around this class here. It will create and it will create something like proxy with this name. And every time you need a method, say, imagine that you have a notification server that produces a bin, you will call or not these methods on the specific class. Email service, notification service, things like that. So the main idea is just to, when it's necessary to inject the bin, depending on the scope, always goes through the proxy if they are marked as bins. These ones, they don't have this proxy unless we explicitly define that proxy, usually using aspect-oriented programming or other annotations like transactions and things like that. Example, singleton guarantee here. So we have this configuration, bin, we have an engine here, return an engine. Here we have a car and engine. When we use this constructor here, since this instance was proxified, he understands that this engine, even if you use in multiple bins, it will return always the same instance. It's quite, and you said, but how can he do this? Because to access this method or access the engine, you have to pass through this class. And this class is proxified like this. So every time you are injecting some of these bins, it should be through this class. But if you to access directly this class, again, it will be the proxy that will be accessed, and in that case, it will choose which instance should be here in the code. Because sometimes you can see that we don't have here a new engine. We are just using engine. Is like use a proxified method. So engine returns the same instance every time. Of course, if you are using singleton, again, there is an option here, a parameter in this annotation that we can change the scope. Okay, pitfall with the component, the bins defined here are not proxified, meaning that if you put bins here, they will be collected by Spring Boot, but there will be no proxy. They're just regular methods. So if you use something like this engine here to create an engine, maybe a new engine, maybe it will be the correct way to do it, it will create a new instance here. It will not be proxified because it doesn't use the configuration. The annotations, the name of the annotations, sometimes they have the same, let's say, conceptual meaning, but they have a different purpose and Spring behaves differently. I've created a video about this when I show that when you use, for instance, the annotation repository, which is a component also, the Spring Boot, for instance, it translates exceptions and do other kinds of things. And the same happens here. So if you put bins here and you put component, it will not be the same behavior as using configuration. It's different. Configuration creates proxies around it. Component doesn't create proxies. It's one of the difference between the configuration and component. Okay, components quite easy. Okay, just a simple diagram. Here, configuration with bin here, we have a Spring context, it's where everything happens. So there is proxies for the configuration class. So this every time we access this app config, we are not accessing the app config, but we are accessing a proxy through a proxy, because every time there is an injection, it should pass through the Spring context. So there will be methods like engine and car. That's the methods that we can use here, like this. Okay. And then, of course, they will return these bins when it's necessary. That's because he goes through the proxy that he understands if it should return the same instance or not. So when to use what? So use component when you have a simple service, utility, or handler class. No bin methods are required. That's usually those classes about user service, user repository, user red controller, entities, and things like that. It's quite common to use in the applications. Use configuration when you need to declare multiple bins manually. You have to customize. You rely on bin methods referencing each other. So it's something that I will dig more deeply in a future video about the relations between these bins and the methods, because they can be interrelated between them, and Spring understands which one should inject first. So at the end of the day, there is also dependency injection when we are using this annotation. Okay, you need to guarantee single behavior. So the configuration guarantees this. Okay, summary. So feature bin discovery component yes, configuration yes. It's not the bin that is discovered, it's the configuration. And after Spring Boot discovers the configuration, we'll look for bins. Okay, don't put just bins in the methods and you forget to put this on the class, and they will be just methods. Okay, declares bins. No, component is not a good idea to declare bins. They will just be regular methods. And configuration, yes, bins will be there. Proxies on components, no, there is no proxy unless you explicitly want them, like using transactions or expect-oriented programming. And here on the configuration, of course, they use cglib, at least at this time, in this version. Maybe they can change to other frameworks to create proxies. And use case, service, utils, and configuration for configuration classes. Of course, at the end of the day, you can simulate a lot with these configurations about the components, but I think everything when we are developing have a purpose, and they were created with that purpose. So try to use it, because it's a way that even in silence you can communicate with your colleagues when they are developing. If you are using configuration, you are implicitly saying in a silenced way, okay, this is configuration bins. So if you are looking for data source, something like that, they will be here. The component, service, and repositories will be our business classes. Okay. So final tip, always prefer configuration for bin factories and setup logic. For instance, data source, it's a good example. Use component for standard stateless Spring managed classes like services, REST controllers, and things like that. And sometimes you really have to use them. For instance, REST controller should have the REST controller, because it's the way for Spring Boot to understand that it's a web server, and it should serialize and deserialize messages and understand the parameters and parse address and things like that. Something that it will not be possible using the annotation bin. So this is what I wanted to say in theory about this. I will show you now quickly the use of a bin and this configuration class, so you see in practice working and you can apply in your projects. And I will promise in future videos I'll go more deeply on about these bins, dependency of bins and scopes and things like that. It's more advanced, and at this time I'm just introducing the concepts that I think they are quite important or really important before developing an application. When you start to develop the application, this is the basic concepts. Then when you start to develop, some use cases start to appear that can be more complicated to implement it with only the basis, and that's when I will provide you videos with complex scenarios and more advanced things around these annotations. So let's see in practice Spring Boot. So how are we using the project that we are developing here? It's quite simple. In my latest video, I added this entities repository with a JDBC template. Is implicitly there is a data source, and this data source existed here in the properties, where it is application properties. So you can see here that I had this. I comment because now I'll use a bin and show you how to create a data source using bin and not the properties file. So before, this is in our previous videos, I was using this data source here, the URL, the driver, the username and password. And now we'll move it to a configuration bin in our Spring Boot. Again, I'm using the H2 database in memory. You can see, I think I created 7 or 8 videos about it. If you are curious about it, it's a database that runs in memory, so I don't need to install, when I'm developing applications, a server on my computer. And this is one of the ways to define this database. And which is great about this database is you can create these files, like here, a schema to create tables here, and the data where we can put some inserts. So when application starts, Spring Boot automatically will inject all of this data in the database. So, but for Spring Boot to understand in which database, it needs to have a data source. And of course, the most common way to provide the data source when you start to develop it is using application properties. But there are other ways, for instance, using bins. Don't forget that the bins, it's the first thing that Spring Boot looks for. So that's why only after all the bins are created, then these schemas and data will start to be executed. So let's see our configuration. I created this configuration here, H2 database config. It's a configuration class. You can see it here. And now I created this method bin. It's a singleton. I mean, this data source will only have one instance. So this is the data source, this is the method, it will return a data source, this is the instance of the bin that will be created. And I'm using this data source build. There are different ways to create a data source in Spring Boot. This is one of the ways using a builder. So we have use a builder pattern create. So again, you have here the URL, the same as this one. So I just copy paste these values here to this class, the driver class name, the username, the password, build. So this will be executed just once. And where is it used? We don't have explicitly used for this in our application, but we have several places where it's used implicitly. And one of these is it's in this repository, the JDBC template, which allows us to do queries to a database, needs a data source. And we are injecting here, without the JDBC template, but JDBC template depends on the data source. One of the constructors of JDBC template, it's a data source. And Spring Boot will look for a bin. When you are using application properties, this will be translated into a bin, this configuration, because of this Spring here, Spring data source, and Spring will understand, okay, this is a bin, I will create a bin for this. But in our case, we ourselves created a bin that was scanned because of this configuration, and then an instance was created and put it on the Spring context, which means that when the JDBC template looks for a data source, you will find it in the Spring context, and you'll be injecting the JDBC template, and JDBC template will be created and injected in our users repository and in our entities repository here. We don't have here the auto wire. It's not mandatory if you only have one constructor, but of course we can use it like this if you want. It's the same. It's optional when we have only one constructor. So let's see this executing. So the application is already executing. I did some change. Maybe you see some change here on the output. Okay, everything seems okay. Okay. No problem. This is asking if I want a default constructor. It's not necessary. It was when I start to write and then I save. That's why, but everything should be working. So let's see now executing our code. So again, if it's the first time that you are seeing this video, I have a REST controller here, a very simple one for the users, where if you run users, it will return all the users by ID and things like that. You can see my previous videos, or if you are interested in the code, I always copy this code. I have zip files locally. One of these days, I promise that I'll put on GitHub and provide some links to all these versionings, or at least for the latest version where we're working, where most of the examples exist. But if you really want the code, you can just ask me and I will put it sooner on the GitHub. So again, it's a REST controller for the users. I have another one for the entities. So you can see entities here, and I pass an ID, and ID will be returned, and these entities will be this data. So you have entity 1, entity 2, entity 3. These are auto numbers here on the schema. You can see I'm using auto increment for users here and entities. So I expect to be 1, 2, 3, and so on. So let's execute the REST controller, and if the data source is working, we should see results. If everything that I said doesn't work, we will not see nothing. So let's change this to 1. So I want to see for you to, okay, you can see that I executed, and you can see here. So it went to the database using our bin, our data source, not the properties file. And the same should be applied for users. I think I have here, maybe this, okay, users. And when I send here, you can see, okay, these are the users that were that exist on the database. They are these 7 users, and you can confirm that here on the data we have these 7 rows here, which are our users. So this is the main difference between the configuration and the component. And now you have the option to put some data source, or more than one data source if you want, on a configuration file. But of course you have questions, okay, if I have 2 data sources, how Spring Boot understands which one should be injected? That's a great question. There will be the need to change some of the code and give different names to the bins to teach Spring Boot which data source should be used in each use case. So I hope you liked this video. I hope it was very educative for you, and maybe you can improve the quality of your applications. So thank you for watching, share with your friends, subscribe my channel so I have motivation to keep creating videos, and I hope to see you in my next video.